Okay, the video has started.
Hello everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Shaman's Way. This is our 19th episode.
Wow.
Anyway, this is our 19th episode, so how's it going today, Cricket?
Today is a great day. It's a Sunday afternoon, and it is a windy, blustery September day, and I am grateful that we are indoors and not outdoors, where the microphones would be clouded over by the sound of awesome wind. What I wanted to do today was take an opportunity to reflect kind of on some of the journeys that I've done previously. So this is less a tutorial on shamanism and more of a reflection on how to interpret what we experience when we're in the journey state. On September the 11th this year, 2016, I took my class with me to learn about psychopomp work. And the reason that we worked on September the 11th is because it is a day that many people in North America remember what happened with the World Trade Center in 2001. What I wanted to do was to revisit the journeys that I had in 2001, right at the same time that the World Trade Center occurred on September the 11th, and then following a few days afterwards. The reason that I want to revisit this, not necessarily because I want to revisit the tragedy or reflect on why people were dying. What I wanted to reflect on were the messages that I received in my journeys. When I received the messages in my journeys, I had no idea the implications that they had laid out for me from a future perspective and how accurate some of the journeys were. What I do know is that when we have journeys, especially if we're new time journeyers, it's very difficult to be able to interpret what we see or what we experience. And because of that, it is a challenge to determine whether or not your journey was quote unquote successful. One of the, I think, most disheartening parts of doing this work is listening to others and their words of, I don't understand this, or I believe I made this up, followed up most closely with, is any of this for real anyway? And I certainly can understand those questions. And I believe that one of the things I know I've talked about several times is understanding the language of shamanism and understanding the language of the journey world and the spirit world. And I really wish that there was a particular book that we could pull out, as fun as Ted Andrews, the Power Animal book, right? Animals Speak. So there are lots of how-to books. But when we have things that we need to interpret for ourselves that occur within our own individual neural pathways and in our own individual experience of interpretation, it can be challenging to necessarily understand what is happening. So I wanted to go back today to some of my notes with regard to the journeys that I had. And I wanted to go back to one of the journeys that I had on September 12th. And what happened on September 12th was I was introduced to a huge white horse on September the 12th. And this huge white horse was the one that was able to lift me up and to fly with this horse. And it seemed so natural to actually get onto an animal that could fly. And many of us know the story of Pegasus. And so this was my very first introduction to a spirit animal that would become a very integral part of my journeys, even up to this very day. So this is, 15 years later. But at the time of that journey, I didn't know what the big white horse signified. I thought that because we were doing spirit work or psychopomp work for the almost 4,000 civilians and firemen and policemen that passed away, I thought that it was a spirit horse. And I thought that this was, in the spirit world's equivalent to the Archangel Michael. This big white horse comes in, like we imagine a big white angel comes in, like we imagine the wings, and that's what I thought it would be about. So it was very surprising to me to find this particular spirit wanting to work with me year after year after year after year. So again, that's an aspect of interpretation. How do I understand what I see, and does what I see, or do I see something that is going to continue for me? And there's really no easy answer to that particular postulation, or what we're postulating. However, from that particular journey, I also was able to speak to, how can I put it? The next part of one of the aspects of another journey that I did, or another part of that journey that I did, was it was as though I was walking through choking smoke and choking dust. And in the journey, I was coughing. And I wrote in my journey, and I wrote in there, lung infection, death from lungs, and question mark. And I also saw drones, and we didn't have drones in 2001. We didn't have drones that were talked about in media like we're talking about drones now, and we actually have rules and regulations with regards to drones because they're becoming more and more invasive and in our daily lives, plus they're being used as a major aspect of warfare. So when I saw the drone in my journey, I had no idea what the drone was, but I remember writing drone, even though I wasn't familiar with what that word was. So again, how do we interpret these things? What I also found out a few years later were the number of firemen that got sick with small cell lung cancer and different types of lung cancers that the first responders were having in regards to breathing in all of the toxic smoke, the toxic chemicals, the debris, all of the things that would have been released by those buildings and by all of the other calamities that occurred as well. So here we have this journey where I'm journeying through, and I'm thinking what is going on, and I can really feel this pain in my lungs. But how do I interpret that? So it wasn't until years later that there actually was an interpretation of this is what is going on. This is what this was about. And the other thing that was really very relevant and frightening to me at the time was, I journeyed for successive days in a row. And I think it was on the 13th or the 14th of September when I actually journeyed to the land that became the Iraq War, and when I journeyed into that part of the world where the particular hijackers had come from, there were cracks that occurred in the soil, and I could see these beings coming up out of the soil, and what I was able to interpret was rage coming out of the soil. And I interpreted really very old, very ancient gods or deities or energy reawakening in that. Little did I know how much geometric pressure would be applied to the soil and to the earth with repeated bombings and repeated, the amount of fissures that would have occurred in the earth, the amount of disturbance within the earth. And that rage did grow out of that. From there, and along in corresponding and parallel was the Al-Qaeda. And then from there we had the ISIS. And so the rage that my journey talked about really did come to pass. And that rage seemed to come literally out of the soil. And I think that it is really sad to see the amount of calamity that has occurred in that part of the world, not specifically because of the World Trade Centers, not specifically because of that, but as a corollary to that. and the amount of wars that are going on, and right to the Arab Spring and the hope for the Arab nations after the Arab Spring, and how Arab Spring didn't work. And there was lots of discussions in my journeys about things along these lines rising up and taking part of it. And I'll read one of the aspects of the journey to you. The color of the energy ball surrounding it was a peach bronze, and I could not go through it. I heard voices, thousands of voices discussing money, and each person was talking about the money that the businesses were going to have destroyed. And I saw the insurance, cost of the insurance, and that it was billions to fix, and someone is going to make millions off this tragedy, which people did. People made millions off the tragedy. Not only the American war machine, but if you think about the black ops that occurred, if we think about some of the privateers that occurred, there is millions to be made in war. And the journey went on. What I wrote on was that the non-rubbing of his head, capitalist greed. So I got to see George W. Bush's face in that. And we will spend more money to catch the money that is the rage of the nation. The rage was every aspect of their lives. And then I see the hole left by destruction. It is a literal wound upon the breast of a mother that has borne the children up to this point. It is a mother crying and angry as a piece of her is slain, a piece of her skin is ripped from her. The scar, a battle scar. The soils crying from below. I cannot enter these holes. The seams start to get, and I see the wound as a gaping wound in her breast, and coming out are swarms of death spirits. They are evil, the evil in the shadows, the spirits that go bump in the night. Swarms of them climbing over the rubble, scurrying up through the sides of buildings. I think about the evil coming out as I start to laugh. Oh my God, the evil is coming. They have no idea what they have done. New York will have a whole new meaning to Bump in the Night. Fight. We must fight. Suddenly I'm in a silver suit and I'm taken to a practice space to battle as I am a warrior to fight this. Then I realize that this is not my body, my battle. My body was shivering. I saw my body in an energy sphere, but first I noticed a burning sensation in my left arm. I know that I get this whenever there is evil about. And then I start to wonder if evil then is on me, or if this is an early warning device. And then I realize that it is the rattlesnake energy. I met the rattler during my new moon ceremony, and the sun spirit. Rattler was on my left, on my feminine side. Balance, there's always balance. The right side has always been the snake side, the full moon, purples and blues. And then I heard the words fire in the head, and then I heard the words fish at your feet, and then moon on the right, sun on your left, north to south, to east to west, the four directions. Then I saw shock waves over the bubble surrounding New York. It looked like lightning, light and dark and balance. Then I was leaving. I saw pictures of the Arab leaders, and I heard the whispers. The Arabs have united and attacked in broad daylight as old bully. The Arab nations have virtual control of oil and gas, and I wrote in brackets, sort of. It is a global standoff. Nothing will ever be the same. Those are some of the interpretations that I had. And rattlesnake energy, to me, also refers to what is the energy of warning, and that being a warning aspect. So when we have these journeys, when we have these experiences, especially in psychopomp experiences, we're not always sure how we're going to interpret these experiences or what these experiences are necessarily going to mean for us. So I have what I wrote later in another journey was I have complete compassion. I go in and I search for one of the pilots and the hijackers. I think in psychopomp work we often forget that compassion has to also not only be given to the victims of any crime, but also to those that perpetrate the victims of the crime. And part of that in interpreting our journeys is that the compassion expressed to spirits outside of yourself reflects on the compassion that you can also reflect upon yourself or also give to yourself. And it was a very challenging time from that. And in the journey it says, suddenly I'm at a training camp and I'm in the middle of a clearing with a huge bonfire in front of me, a forest behind me. I can hear the birds and I can hear the whistles of men behind me talking. I am huge. I am male, 6'2" at least, 250 pounds. I am wearing brown army coat and jacket. I have a brimmed hat on my head. I am definitely Arabic. In my hands is a strong-looking drone instrument, and I am playing it really well. It is electric. It rides above me. It sends out waves of violet and indigo. The vibrations were calling. The hijackers would never respond to a woman. I was instead a god musician. My instrument kept changing from one of the 3 strings. All of the 12 hijackers came out of the forest and into the clearing. They all had died quickly and extremely violently. The skin of one of them was blown off, leaving a gaping hole in the side of his head. Fire through a skeleton is such a wonderful sight. I was being a titch sarcastic there. They were mesmerized by my playing, and over to my right was a star staircase leading up. Suddenly I am a woman completely covered, just a small slit for my eyes, and I started to sing. They came towards the staircase. They're crossing over. This takes a long time. After they are over, and I am dumped backwards onto the street. I move through the workers, tired and coughing and getting sick. And then I wrote in bracket, many will die of lung scarring from asbestos and from the different chemicals. I touched all that I could see. I sang praises to the spirits of the people who had come en masse to help the souls. When I first journeyed the night of the attacks, I saw for the very first time in doing psychopomp work, I was able to see surrounding me the thousands of people who had gathered, who were healers, who were all intent on doing the same thing, helping the souls cross over and to try to give peace and some semblance of peace to the survivors and to the aftermath. It was the first time that I had encountered people that I didn't know were journeying in the journey state, and that was really quite an eye-opening experience for me. Since then, I've only encountered that 2 other occasions, and they were in equally large, tragic circumstances. So as we move on through this, what are some of the things that I had to do? So I swam into a pool, leaving everything behind. I created a veil to cross through the sky, an upper world, leaving reality behind, or the divine connection, the air spirits. So banishment and protection on each stair, and how, what I'm talking about in my journey there is how can I protect myself when I come out of a journey when you're encountering such incredible tragedies and souls that don't know you from Adam and don't know whether or not they want to help you or they don't know whether or not they want to receive your help. Those are all aspects of the journey. How do we interpret that? One of the ways that we learn to interpret that in the ability to interpret the sickness and the illness and people dying from that would be just simply understanding the physiology, and that if I'm coughing in a journey and I'm finding things really acrid or very difficult, it means to me that there's going to be that same similar effect on the outside world. When I see huge gaping holes and evil slipping through that, I don't necessarily want to interpret that as evil spirits coming out, but maybe the potentiality of evil. And when I saw the shakeup of evil coming out of the streets of New York, it almost seemed like it was a clearing of New York. And what I read for at least 2 years after, and then I didn't follow up on it any further, was the reduction in crime in New York City and the compassion of one New Yorker towards another New Yorker, where I think most people who don't live within that part of the world, in the New York State and in that region, I think many people saw New York as a very dangerous place to go, and that there was a lot of muggings and there was a high murder rate and so on and so forth. So what I interpreted in that journey was that the spirits were gathering to help clean that out. And that was a really, from my perspective, that was a very I couldn't have predicted that. I guess is really what I wanted to say to that. The other aspects of watching the hijackers, one would assume, this would be my assumption, one would assume that many prayers would have been said by the various hijackers. And, there would have been, from my perspective, and I'm only going from my perspective, I have absolutely no way of saying whether or not this is a reality, would be that those who were chosen to do such high-ranking jobs as flying planes into buildings, that there would be a lot of prayer and a lot of wanting Allah to bless them and wanting Allah to take them from that particular experience and take them straight up into heaven for whatever the rewards are. And I don't know enough about the traditions to know what the rewards were. So when I encountered the spirits of the hijackers in that wooded area, that really surprised me. And it may also have been a metaphor for cleaning up the hatred that people would have directed towards those souls. So it could have been that. It could have been releasing those souls from the hatred that was directed upon them. It could also really well have been that those souls were stuck, and what would occurred was psychopomp work. And I found it very interesting that in that experience, I was dressed as a male. Generally, when I journey, what you see is what you get. I am my own self. I don't change my physical appearance. I am my own self. So I pay very special attention when my body has been morphed into the opposite sex or into something else. So how do you interpret that in your journeys? Do you interpret that the masculine aspect of myself is what was needed? Or do I interpret it that my spirit had to shift in order to be seen by those spirits? And then to shift into a woman wearing the complete burqa. What does that mean? Does that mean that I have to hide myself in the spirit world in order to fit in with that group of people? And how do I interpret that? So there are different ways. We can take things very literally, and I don't mind taking things literally by any stretch of the imagination. And we can also take things to mean it from a metaphorical perspective. So how do we interpret this? How do we work with this? What do we do with this? The other aspect of doing work like this that was very important that came out of my journey was my spirits were very specific as to how to protect my own house when I came out of these journeys. I have taken various precautions, but in 2001, I can't necessarily say that I wouldn't have known all of the precautions. So they were very deliberate with very specific things for me to do. So sometimes our journeys can be very, very literal. And then what I learned over the years was how to negotiate, because sometimes spirits don't know what you have or don't have available to you in this world. So their relationship to cayenne pepper for me was a spice, but their relationship to cayenne pepper was that it was a very good tool for clearing space and making sure your space was clear. And if I had not asked the question, why am I putting cayenne pepper, I probably would have dismissed it. And then cayenne pepper came into my ceremony work when I would do clearings for big places that were very active with ghosts. And when I would do rituals in spaces that I knew were very haunted, then I would use cayenne pepper then. So my spirits taught me a really good lesson in that regard, right? And they also taught me and I don't use runes. Runes are not my way of using divination. And they showed me a rune to write on my chest. And when I came out of the journey, I had no idea what this particular rune meant. And I asked a friend of mine who had a set of runes and a book. And so when I looked it up, it was the rune of protection. So sometimes we have really literal things that help us in our journeys. And I really know that the way to encourage a person to continue to journey and not become frustrated by what they are experiencing is, first of all, to write down your journeys. Second of all, to revisit them. And the third thing to do is to continue to practice. So if we have water showing up in your journey, does that mean that in that water is where you cleanse yourself, or does that water mean your deepest psyche? Or does the water just mean you're west on the medicine wheel? Or does water mean you have to relax and go to the beach? So there are so many interpretations to things. And if you're not familiar with your journey state, if you're not familiar with the way that you are presented with information from the spirit world, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult to interpret. And then some journeys are completely interpretable and they are black and white, and I've encountered those. So does that make sense to you, Doug?
It does, yeah.
And can you refer to some of the journeys that you've done over the years that you were able to build a relationship to either another spirit or an element based on accessing those venues various times over?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple. I think I had a few that I bounced into more than once, that you start interpreting it much more quickly as soon as you see them, and you can kind of read their language as opposed to someone news language that you run into, for sure.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things is I often am asked by people when I run journeys or when I run circles, how do I interpret this journey? And to be very honest with you, sometimes I just want to jump right in and interpret their journey for them, because I've been doing it for so many years that I have my own reality, and I have my own interpretation, a logbook of, a log means this, a tree means this, water means this, and this means this. So I do have a good understanding of the spirit world from my perspective. But in honesty, I cannot truly interpret that journey for that person because I wasn't there. However, I do know that in listening to literally thousands of journeys over the years, I have learned that there are very specific symbols in place. And I've talked about this in other podcasts where we talk about the shamans of old have journeyed so many times to a particular place or so many times to a particular lesson that they leave that signpost in the collective unconscious, so that when we journey and we encounter that signpost in the collective unconscious, then all of a sudden we have more information accessible at our fingertips than if we didn't go into that collective unconscious. So I think when we do journey of psychopomp work, we've been psychopomping for as long as we've held burials. As long as we've held burials, there have been traditions and rituals that have focused and centered around how to get from point A to point B, point A being Earth and point B to being whatever you believe the spirit world looks like or whatever your afterlife looks like. So that, in essence, that would be an aspect of how do we interpret things. And when they give us ideas, part of the negotiation, as I was saying earlier, is that sometimes they give you really, really great ideas, but we don't have access to broadcloth, or we don't have access to burlap sacks. We don't have access to XYZ. So that's when the negotiation with spirit comes into play. I had an experience a couple of weeks ago where I was doing some unraveling of curse work for somebody, and I encountered a very old spirit, and the very old spirit wanted something that this person had wrapped in burlap and taken into the ground. And I had to remind this spirit that my client did not live on a farm and did not have access to burlap sacks. Second of all, that finding burlap sacks when now we use a nylon threaded sack becomes a whole other story. So if she can't find burlap sack, can we negotiate on something that would be acceptable to the spirit and acceptable to us? So is that aspect of it. So I think when you journey enough times and you get your confidence boots on, then as we walk through the spirit world, we have confidence with us and we know that we can make negotiations, because if the spirits would like something done in this world, we're the vessel for doing it. And if we don't have the tools, we can't enact what the spirits have specifically asked us to do. So it makes it an interesting conundrum to be able to say, well, okay, I appreciate what you're saying. However, let's do this. But then there are times, just as in the journey that I read, where there is very specific information. There's very specific information. These people are going to get lung cancer and they're going to die. Very specific information of the rage that came from the Arab nations with respect to the American people and the unnecessary war in Iraq. And that was very specific. The other thing that was very specific in the journey was the determination of how much money was going to be made, the billions of dollars that was going to be lost by the insurance agency, and the trillions of dollars that was going to be spent by the U.S. Defense Fund. And that was very clear and very apparent. It was also very clear and very apparent for me to revisit compassion for those that, in my mind's eye, deserve no compassion, i.e. the hijackers, right? i.e. the murderers. How do those people deserve compassion? And how are these things when I look back on it 15 years later? And I have to be very honest that I left many of these journeys behind for many years. And it wasn't until I was doing a drumming circle, I was a guest host for a drumming circle, that I thought, I wonder if I should actually look at those journeys that I did for September the 11th and find out what has actually come to pass. So when I reread those journeys and found out how much had come to pass, and I'm only giving just a brief snapshot of the pages and pages and pages of writing that I've done, it is sobering to look back on it. And that's, for me, another clue to figuring out your journeys is to recording them. We don't remember them. I would not have remembered these details. When I read them 13 years later, I was like, holy shit, I forgot I did that. Or my God, I didn't realize that was how it was. And I also can look back with old eyes and see the actual timeline of this is what happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and can see the domino effect and can see the tragic of that effect. But doing the journey work for that particular tragedy was probably one of them, also the most emotional. So then we have to understand what is making you emotional, what is mine and what is theirs. And that's another aspect of journey work. When we come across a suffering being or we come across a situation like that, it is very emotional work, but it's not your emotions. I came back and I was laying on the floor in my basement and really crying very hard. And I don't believe I was crying because it was affecting me as a human being, but it made me cry because it was such an emotional outpouring for other people. So we are the conduit for that emotion. To be very honest with you, I didn't realize 9/11 had happened. I was on my way driving to work, and I was listening to CBC, and I noticed that it was past the hour point, and they always do their news on the hour, on the half hour, but instead there was this amazing blues singer on the radio, and I was driving to work just enthralled. I was like, who is sleeping on the ball? Why is there not news on? My God, this is the best blues I've ever heard. And then when I get to the office, I parked my car and the news still hadn't come on. I think they were scrambling, trying to get the news together. Then I got into the office and I realized what had happened. So for me, my first memory of 9/11 is awesome blues music. So so was I emotionally affected that day? No. Did I find it an absolute holy moly, look at this tragedy on North American soil? Absolutely. Did I foresee any of the long-term implications that I'm talking about? Absolutely not. So it was an interesting point of reflection, and I think I will end it at this point and say that would be the end of this particular podcast. Any questions?
No, interesting stuff. It's pretty deep stuff, so good to listen to.
Thank you for listening. And I think what I wanted to end off with is to remind people not to be discouraged. Not to be discouraged if what they experience they are unable to necessarily figure out. I don't want them to be discouraged by that, for the very simple reason that I think we really need to have patience, because we can't become stellar overnight. It is a step-by-step process. So enjoy it while you can, because there will be a day when you are so proficient in journeying that there isn't a lot of question left over. So enjoy the quagmire of confusion while you can. Enjoy the luxury of multiple interpretations, and know that as you journey on, there will always be multitudes of interpretations. It's what is your experience and how do you interpret it based on your experience.
Maybe what I'll do is add to the forums a section for journey questions and stuff, and that way if anybody does have any questions on or challenges interpreting, they can toss them in there and get some help from other listeners or from yourself. And
I think that's a great idea. That's a great idea.
Cool. Excellent. Definitely appreciate everyone listening, and if you are enjoying the podcast, it helps us out a lot if you can head over to iTunes or wherever you're listening from and give us a quick rating and leave some comments. We do take a look at those, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks.
Bye.